So, is your beer having problems keeping its head? Well, stick around to find out what you can do to get a foamier beer. So hi and welcome to this video, and we're going to be talking about how to get better head retention in your homemade beer. So first of all, let's talk about what actually makes the foam or the head on your beer. Now there are three main components to this. The first being protein, which is naturally occurring in the grains that we have in our beer that we use in the brewing process. Next we have the alpha acids, which come mainly from the hops in our beer, and also the level of carbon dioxide that comes from the carbonation process, whether that's bottle conditioning or false carbonation. If you've got bad head retention, it's likely to be an imbalance between these three main components. So before we actually talk about proteins, alpha acids and carbonation, let's talk about some more common problems that lead to bad head retention. And the first issue is really cleaning your equipment and sanitizing it. So one of the traps that many new brewers fall into is actually washing their brewing equipment with soap or detergent-based products. And this can be a real problem for head retention. The reason is that the soap can leave a sort of oily residue which actually combats this balance between the proteins, the alpha acids and the carbon dioxide. So the best way to clean your equipment is actually just plain hot water and good old elbow grease. Now, if this isn't going to work to remove some of the organic residue on your beer equipment, then consider using a non-detergent based soap such as OxyClean. This is perfectly fine because it doesn't leave any extra aroma or taste, and as long as you give your equipment a good rinse at the end of the process, there's no problem using this type of non-detergent based product. When it comes to sanitizing your beer equipment, I would say go for a good non-rinse sanitizer, something like Starsan. You can of course use a normal household bleach solution, but the problem here is that it's going to take a lot longer to clean and sanitize your equipment because you have to leave it for up to 30 minutes in soak. Whereas these non-rinse sanitizers, you literally put your equipment in for about 20 to 30 seconds, get some contact between the equipment and the solution, and you're good to go. And of course, you don't need to rinse it, so there's no issue there at all. So if you're fairly sure that you've been doing a good job with cleaning and sanitizing, well, maybe it's time that we talk about the actual ingredients that you're using. The question really is, do you have enough foam producing compounds in the beer? One of the methods that brewers use to reduce the protein content of the beer is called a protein rest. This is when you actually keep the temperature of the wort at a steady 122 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, around 50 to 60 degrees Celsius. And by doing this and keeping the temperature at that level for about 20 to 30 minutes, you give enzymes that are naturally occurring in the grain an opportunity to break down the protein. The problem here is if you're not using 100% unmalted grains, things like corn, rice, oatmeal for example, you actually don't need to do a protein rest, or often it's unrecommended to do it. So if you do this when it's not necessary, you might actually be reducing the proteins that you need for head retention later on. Another thing to consider using is head enhancing malts, because they're rich in proteins and dextrins. However, if you just use these types of malts exclusively, they're going to have a lot more tannins, and that's actually going to affect the clarity of your beer. So just play around with small amounts of crystal and dark malts in your grain bill, and this may help you get a better head retention overall. So as I mentioned before, alpha acids are very important in head retention too, and these come from the hops that we use in our brewing process. However, don't just add extra hops in the hope of getting more alpha acids. This can actually be very bad for your beer, and it can affect the balance between those sweet malts and that bitterness from the hops. It's far better to select hops that have a higher percentage alpha acid and actually use them sparingly. rather than just dumping a lot more hops into your fermenter or into your boil. So this brings us to carbonation. There are two main ways to carbonate a beer. The most popular for new brewers is probably going to be bottle conditioning because it requires less equipment and is relatively inexpensive. So what you do here is you add priming sugar directly to the bottle, and this extra sugar is going to activate any dormant yeast in your beer, and that yeast will convert those new sugars into CO2, and that will carbonate your beer. So the main problem here is if you don't add enough of a priming solution, you're not going to get the carbonation to the levels that you want. So the easiest way to get this right, go online, find a priming sugar calculator or get an app and put in the required details, and you're going to get exactly how much priming sugars you need to add to those bottles. So the second type of carbonation is called forced carbonation, and this takes place in a keg. What you do is you pour your beer into the keg, and then you raise the internal pressure of that keg so that the beer is forced to take on that carbon dioxide and absorb it and become carbonated. Now the main problem here is that people don't raise the PSI to the correct level or for long enough. So as a general rule, around 20 PSI for about 2 to 3 days should be fine for most beers. But don't forget, when you're going to dispense the beer, you actually want to reduce the PSI level down to about 10 to 12 PSI, and if you have about a 5-foot beer line, that should avoid any over foaming of your beer as well. However, carbon dioxide is not the only way to carbonate a beer. You can also think about using a mix of CO2 and nitrogen. So as a general rule, if you're serving a stout, you can go for about a 25% to 75% mix of carbon dioxide and nitrogen. For most ales and lagers, you're looking at maybe about a 60% carbon dioxide mix to a 40% nitrogen mix. And this is what most commercial brewers do. However, be aware that if you've got a higher mix of carbon dioxide than nitrogen, you're actually going to need 2 separate gas cylinders. So it's something worth thinking about for your budget. Another way to get better head retention in your beer, especially if you're not using 100% malted grains in your grain bill, is to use a head retention additive. So these are products that you can add either at the boil or during fermentation, and they will help to get better head retention in your beer. However, be aware that these types of products actually affect the character of your beer, and generally they're going to soften the features of that beer. There's a couple more causes of bad head retention that we should cover. The first one I want to talk about is using any sort of adjuncts or adding any sort of compounds to your beer. So things like using coffee, chocolate, or any fruit pills. The problem with these types of adjuncts is they have a fairly high level of fat, and fat is really going to combat that mix of proteins, alpha acids, and CO2. So what you want to do to avoid bad head retention when using these types of ingredients is to really let your beer settle after fermentation. And then when you're racking your beer, when you're transferring your beer into your keg or to your bottles, you really want to leave about 1 to 2 inches at the bottom. So this is what we call the trub, all that material that's sunk down to the bottom of the fermenter. A good way to do this is to actually have your tube that you use to transfer the beer, have it hanging above the bottom of your fermenter by about 1 or 2 inches. That way you're very unlikely to get any of that unwanted material in your final product. So if you feel like you've been doing everything right in terms of ingredients, carbonation and cleaning, then you could actually have a problem with the type of glass that you're using. Now, not all beer glasses are made equal, and using the very common shaker or nonic imperial pint glass is not going to do most beers justice. Let's say that we're brewing a very high alcohol and carbonated Belgian beer. Well, putting it into a shaker or a nonic pint glass is just not going to give the beer its best, especially when it comes to head retention. So you need to match the right beer for the right glass. So let's say with that Belgian beer, rather we should be using a nice goblet or a chalice glass. And this will help a lot of that CO2 escape, but also keep a decent head on the top of the beer. The same way if you're brewing something like a Hefeweizen, if you look at those traditional Hefeweizen glasses, they have that little lip on the top of the glass, and that's actually to encourage the head to build. So consider the type of glass that you're using, and if you think you're using the wrong glass, then you should start using something more appropriate for that beer. Also, talking about glasses, the same problem comes with the soap. So if you're cleaning your glasses, or someone's cleaning your glasses with soap and not rinsing them thoroughly, then this could actually lead to your head just breaking down. So always make sure you rinse your glasses thoroughly, or you clean them just with hot water. Another thing to consider is the actual serving temperature of your beer. So most modern refrigerators keep beer at the wrong temperature. So as a general rule of thumb, if you're serving something like an ale, you shouldn't be serving it above about 44 degrees Fahrenheit, which is around 7 degrees Celsius. For something like a lager, no colder than 42 degrees Fahrenheit, which is around 6 degrees Celsius. For most stouts, you can serve it no colder than about 55 degrees Fahrenheit, which is around 13 degrees Celsius. However, when it comes to things like barley wines, some stouts and some ales, you can actually serve them at room temperature. Now, I'm not just saying that because I'm a Brit, it is true. It really depends on the beer recipe. If you want to find out a little bit more about how to get better head retention in your beer, head over to my website at beercreation.com/head. Hopefully you found this video very useful, and if you did, consider sharing it with a friend. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and that way you won't miss any of the videos that I upload in the future. Also, if you have any other questions, leave me a comment, I'll get back to you. Thanks very much for watching, see you next time.